Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is 10:30 on a Monday. It's a beautiful sunny day so far. Pretty nice. We had some crappy weather again this weekend. It's been rainy and pretty much a washout or just super gray, overcast. But it is what it is. It's every weekend we've been doing that. But I try to enjoy the nice weather when we can. So yeah, it's Monday. So yeah, start of a brand new week. So today's show is going to be on Thunderbolts. I saw the new Marvel movie yesterday. I went to a matinee with a buddy. I had not been to a matinee in a really long time, and it was fun to go to the movies. We went to the 1:30 show. We went to the Colonial Theater, which is a theater I used to go to religiously back in the day, and but now it's pretty sporadic. Most of the time now, when I go to the movies, I end up going to Flagship Cinema, which is about 40 minutes or so from my house. The only reason I end up going there more often is just because they have, schedule wise, and they have more show times. They obviously have more movies to choose from, but a couple of my friends that live kind of down in the area in Thomaston and Rockland area and Waldoboro area, that theater's pretty close for them. So we end up, I have a little crew of friends that I sometimes go to the movies with. So that's what we do, and it's it's just a little more convenient. But anyway, I try to go to the Colonial because that's a mom and pop place, and I try to support them. And they've, they went to hell and back basically because they were closed for a long time because of COVID, and they took a lot of hits, but they're doing really well it seems now, and it's really great to see. But anyway, I did a show yesterday on my feelings about going to see Thunderbolts, which is the latest Marvel movie. When I think of, and basically I did a video just my thoughts about going to the movie to see Thunderbolts. My big thoughts on the state of comic book movies in general, and how it's there's so many movies. It's well, I've at this point, I don't know, 15 years in or whatever, how long it's been. I've lost count as to how many there are, especially with Marvel and also the DC comic book movies. And it's funny because I had a lot of mixed feelings about going to see Thunderbolts, but then I was kind of excited because again, I love going to the theater. I love that experience. We did see a trailer for the new, which I'm actually a really big fan of, the Mission Impossible movies. I'm actually a really big Mission Impossible fan. And there was the trailer for the new one that's coming out this summer, which actually looks super dope. So I'm excited to see that. Supposedly this might be the last one, but we'll see. And it's the whole thing: sitting in a dark room with a bunch of strangers or friends, and getting to see. I love seeing the trailers for films, and having that whole experience. And so that, from that perspective, it was really good. And with Thunderbolts, this was going into it. Uh, these were a bunch of characters that I was not familiar with. Again, growing up, I was a huge, massive comic book fan as a kid. When I was a real little kid, I uh, I used to go to a shop, comic book shops all the time. There was where I grew up in New York. There literally was a comic book shop right up the street from me. So I used to go there, pretty much when I was in my diapers, and buy comic books. So I was always a fan, and I remember my first kind of attraction to comic books, the first titles that I got or characters I got into. My favorite superhero character of all time is Batman, of course, from DC. And after that, that was the first character I got into as far as a hero, and just became a massive fan. It still remains my favorite character. Superman, I became a real big Superman fan. X Men, Daredevil. I mean, the list is endless. So, and I remember years into, when I was starting to become on the verge of becoming a teenager, I was still buying tons of comic books. Every now and then, I still buy them too. Every now and then, every, you know, every now and then, if I'm somewhere and there is comic books available at a shop or I see a really good deal, I might buy them. So it's still something that is part of me. But I remember reaching a point where I got a little bit older and I was like, you know what, these would make really fantastic movies someday. And at that time, outside of people in my age group, comic books were not taken seriously by anyone. They were just looked at as just, silly little books that kids read. And then, fast forward 15 to 20 years from that, the age of the graphic novel came out. You had writers like Frank Miller and other artists that started doing these graphic novels where the themes and a lot of the stories were a lot darker. They were more adult oriented, and then suddenly you had this influx of, suddenly comic books were being read by, all ages, not just kids, and the adult themes were explored. There were much more adult themes, if, explored in a lot of these books and novels, and it got a lot more attention, and it was taken a little bit more seriously as far as entertainment, but then also just as an art form. And then eventually you had the movies that came out, all the 2000 or 2 million DC comics, or I should say Marvel movies that have come out. And the first wave, I was, a massive fan of all of the first few movies. And, when it got to the apex of kind of where everything was leading to where you had the Avenger films, with Infinity War and Endgame, especially Infinity War, where for me, I think even to this day, and it's been out for, I don't know, almost 10 years now, which is crazy. But for me, Infinity War is the greatest overall, pound for pound, probably the greatest comic book movie ever made. And also Endgame is just amazing. And after that, and with the exception of the last Spider-Man film, which I believe was Homecoming, I think. With the exception of that, which came out a few years after that, I feel, and there's been, hundreds of movies since then that have come out. Maybe not quite hundreds, but it feels like it. And everything since those movies has been really, I feel, undercooked or just an utter disappointment. It just feels like, the Marvel set the bar so high with those particular films. And ever since then, everything else has just been either mediocre or not very good or even terrible or just okay or just a disappointment, with a plethora of films that have come out, with what happened with the Iron Man films, and then also eventually with the Guardians of the Galaxy films. I mean, the list is endless. And with the exception of Deadpool and Wolverine, which is really its own thing, which I thought, which came out, I believe, last year, which was just awesome. And I felt, after those films came out, Infinity War, Endgame, and Spider-Man Homecoming, Disney owns all of the rights to all of the Marvel universe. And I felt like after, especially with Deadpool, because I felt Deadpool and Wolverine, they really pushed the envelope as far as content, what they can do, showing violence and adult themes. I thought they were like pushing the boundaries, but in a good way. And I felt before Deadpool and Wolverine, I felt the movies needed to, and the universe as a whole, really needed to either just end where they were, because how can they top what was established, and going out like they did. And if they were going to come back and make all of these other movies, which that you kind of knew they were, they really needed to do something different, and you really needed to rattle the cage, or go down a totally different path, and really give something new, because do something completely different in some ways, or just something really fresh. And the whole series and franchise, I think there's a lot of things why I feel like a lot of these movies didn't work, and I think a lot of it is because a lot of Disney executives holding things back. They have become. I feel like the movies have become increasingly even more family friendly, and safe and sanitized, not really taking any risks. I think Infinity War Endgame took some risks, and especially Infinity War. But I think it was, and obviously Deadpool Wolverine really took risks. And I think the whole world of the MCU needed to really do that, and to go to certain places, and in order to follow up such, incredible films. I mean, because where do you go after that? You set the bar so high. And so I've been so, for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been just so let down by all of the Marvel movies that have come out, and a lot of the DC movies. There's been some that have been, you know, as far as DC goes, the Justice League, the Zack Snyder cut, I think that's epic, and I think that's incredible. I really love the James Gunn version of Suicide Squad. Super awesome movie, super underrated. And that's really, those are the movies that stand out that have come out in the last few years. And there's been a bunch of other films since then. And I've just been really disappointed. Up until this point, well, I did see Deadpool and Wolverine in the theater, which I totally love that movie. Super awesome. But before that, the last Marvel movie I had seen in the theater was Ant-Man Quantumania, which was the third one. I was so utterly disappointed and just bored with that movie that I literally fell asleep. And after that, I was like done. I had no excitement. All the wind was taken out of my sails as far as seeing new movies, because I tried and tried. I'd seen quite a few other films, not in the theater, tied to the MCU, and I was just utterly disappointed, and everything was flatlined to me. So, going into Thunderbolts, I really didn't have any desire to see this movie, because of how things have been for so long with the entire franchise. So, just getting into the movie itself, overall, so we saw Thunderbolts yesterday, and overall, I thought this was a much better movie than a lot of the other ones I've seen in the last few years. I thought it was original, and again, I wanted to, I think testimony to a really good movie. One of the biggest problems with so many Marvel movies is that, if you didn't know about all facets of the universe, if you didn't see a particular television show, because there's a billion spin-off television shows based on these characters and all of these movies. And one of the big problems is, you know, if you didn't see any of these other things and you saw a new Marvel movie, you were utterly, clueless, and you just didn't know who any of these characters were. And I think, to make a good movie, it should be just a good movie. You shouldn't need to know, 10,000 other facts before you go into a movie. I think you should be able to go into any movie cold and be able to enjoy it, and to be able to immerse yourself in that universe, and hopefully be attracted to the characters. I think there's been examples of that in the Marvel universe. You know, so I think one of the best examples of that is Logan, which is based on the Wolverine character, Marvel character. One of the greatest comic book movies ever made. You could go into that completely cold and not, you know, and completely lose yourself in that movie, because that movie I think is a masterpiece. And there's other examples of other, more traditional Marvel movies that's happened. I think some of the Thor movies, some of the Iron Man, the first Iron Man film, and I even think the Avenger films. I think Infinity War is so damn good. You could, even though it does help to know the world or universe, I think that movie is so damn good that you could just, enjoy it for what it is. And I think so. Every movie, I think a movie needs to stand on its own two legs and be able to tell what it's, really say what it's going to say and really establish what the story is. And you shouldn't have to know, again, 10,000 other things before you go into it. And I thought Thunderbolts, again, none of these characters, I had heard from other people and a good friend that what they were doing with this film was incredibly different from the comic books. I was not familiar with the characters of Thunderbolts, growing up as a kid. I never read any of their comics. So I went into this completely cold as far as that goes, not knowing anything about who these people were or who these characters were. And I was like, okay, well, if this movie's good, it should, you know, I shouldn't have to necessarily know all that stuff. I should just be engaged with it. And I thought overall this movie did a pretty good job with characters I had no idea who they were, of establishing, you know, their place kind of in the world, in the film, and enough of the backstory. The writing was pretty good. There was pretty good characterizations of each of these characters, again, which were totally foreign to me. And the other thing that I thought was pretty good about this film was it had a little bit more restraint. It wasn't so focused on all the bells and whistles, with having billions of $1 billion thrown into, action sequences. I think this movie kind of pulled back a little bit from that, and had a little bit more restraint, probably in a good way, of just trying to tell a story and introducing action that could kind of augment the story, not just trying to pull things back a little bit. And I thought overall the film did a pretty good job doing that. I felt like, on one hand, it was kind of formulaic, but I thought it was interesting enough, and it had some new ideas and concepts. The film has a theme about, more or less, kind of alienation, personal alienation, and kind of the focus is also on depression, really, and how a lot of these characters all kind of have these paths from, that are connected that way. So it has a little bit of a different thing that way. The cast is really good. The acting is actually really great. Florence Pugh is really fantastic. It's something to see. It's really pretty unbelievable to see how big her career has gotten. She was, the first film I ever saw her in was Ari Aster's Midsummer, which is a total fucking masterpiece. She's so awesome in it, but it's really something to see that now she's in the Marvel universe and in the MCU. Lewis Pullman was also in this film, who I never heard of before. Geraldine Viswanathan, Kurt Russell's son, who plays he plays an agent who is kind of this version of Captain America, who is not quite as important or just never really rose to the occasion, I guess, if you will. Wyatt Russell, and my favorite actor in the film, David Harbour, who I think is just awesome. I love David Harbour. He's such a great character actor. He can really do anything. I'm a huge fan of his. He's really great in this film. So, again, overall, I enjoyed the film. I thought it was a pretty good introduction to considering, for me, just as a viewer, to characters I had no idea about. It was engaging enough. I thought some of the action was pretty good. And I was also a really big fan of the villain, the Sentry, who was played by uh, Lewis Pullman. I thought his character was kind of badass, actually, when he first appears on the big screen. And basically, he's like this superhero or supervillain kind of created in a laboratory. Basically the same technology that was kind of more or less used to create the super soldier Captain America. But he takes on this, insane power where he's essentially very, very similar to like, well, more or less a like evil and an evil Superman kind of a character. And he kind of has this power like where he's essentially a god. And I thought his character was kind of badass, and I was like, this is pretty good. The stakes were pretty high. There were times during that moment, those moments of where they introduced his character, and the conflict between the Sentry and the uh, Thunderbolts, where it gave me these feelings of the excitement that I felt that I had felt when I saw the Avenger films. Like it had a little bit of that epicness to it, that scope, and I was interested in it. I thought, okay, this is good. I haven't felt this way about a movie in a long time. But then there was this section of the film of where that character, the Sentry, kind of disappears and becomes this other alter ego, if you will, character called the Void, and I thought that was kind of cool and interesting. And where the character goes in relation to the kind of the darkness of the film, I thought that was pretty decent. But ultimately, I was by the end of the film, I kind of was underwhelmed by this movie. I thought it was solid. I thought it was a nice change of pace for once of where it was a pretty good story. But I do think, this movie was talked about that this movie was going to be, really dark and really kind of pushing the envelope. That was what people were saying about this film, and from what I heard about the original source material is that that was a big component of this movie. And I felt like the biggest disappointment with this movie, that I don't know, I have to say these aspects kind of ultimately were, for me, the things that kind of dragged down this movie to the point of where I I was kind of disappointed with it. I felt this movie was really it played it safe. It really played it safe. Those at like the dark aspects, like it hinted at a lot of these things around these characters that had these dark pasts, suffer from depression, and these demons that they carry around, and especially towards the end, I thought this movie really played it safe. It felt like they really wanted to keep. They were introducing these kind of heavier, darker themes, but then they ultimately. I feel like Disney ultimately were like, no, we got to keep this a family friendly movie, and we gotta, we can't go to those places. We can't rattle the cage, and I felt like that was disappointing because they were essentially that's the core of the story. And I felt like this movie was way more sanitized than I thought it was, going to be. And from what, you know, people were saying about this movie early on, and what the story, from talking to people who were fans of Thunderbolts, particularly like my good friend Mike, I thought this film was going to be significantly darker in tone and, a little bit more, pushing the envelope a little bit. But this movie didn't push the envelope at all, really. It was, it felt really sanitized as far as when it came to those aspects of it. So, and I felt by the end of the film that kind of thing really overshadowed my kind of enjoyment of the movie. And I just felt underwhelmed. I thought, okay, you have a movie that's come along in this massive universe that is establishing something that's pretty good, and you're kind of getting everything back on track a little bit. But then ultimately, it doesn't really go to those places to make this movie really successful. And I just left the film kind of like, it's okay. It's okay. It's not a terrible movie. It's not fantastic. It's good. It's kind of decent, I guess. And I just left the movie kind of underwhelmed after they were, feeling they were, again, bringing into these themes of depression and kind of these darker elements. And I felt like they were doing a pretty good job. First couple acts, first act, second act, going to the third act, but they never really did anything with it. And I felt like they really curtailed all of those things, and they made it this. Oddly enough, this film felt, and I know Disney. I mean, yeah, Disney is Disney, of course, but I felt, well, I honestly think ever since Deadpool and Wolverine came out, which that movie really pushed the envelope. I felt, and that it's a Disney property again, and they really, um, that was part of the breaking the third wall with the Deadpool Wolverine film, is trying to, you know, push that envelope. Like, wow, look what we can get away with, even though we're a Disney property, and they did such a fantastic job with that. And I thought this movie was going to kind of. I felt since that movie came out that we were gonna see more movies that were gonna take more chances like that. And I feel like this movie, as far as that, in regards to that kind of area, was a complete step back from that. And ultimately, it was really disappointing. I think the Avenger movies are far darker. I think Infinity War is a very, very dark film, incredibly dark film. And this is like a total step back. And that movie came out, over 10 years ago. And I just I don't get why they need to like feel like, as a studio and as a franchise, a massive franchise, they need to play things fucking safe all the time. And so you know, when the movie was over, again, my feelings of enjoyment, and again, I was into the story. I thought the pacing was good. I liked the acting. I thought, okay, this is pretty good. I'm kind of getting into it. It had feelings at times of where, it kind of brought back the excitement that I had when I first saw the Avenger films. But by the end, when they kind of just cut off exploring more of those themes, it ultimately, I felt underwhelmed by the movie, and I was just kind of like, it's okay, you know, it's okay. It's better than most of the more recent Marvel movies that I've seen by as far as, just a more cohesive story, something that's a little bit more restrained as far as, not having to throw all the bells and whistles into the mix. This, and I felt like this was a little bit more of its own standalone film at first, but ultimately, I have to say I was pretty disappointed with this movie. It was good until it kind of wasn't, and I'm kind of back. Honestly, I'm kind of back at square one with my feelings around the the predicament of where this universe is. And famously for all of these movies, there's always the post credit, trailers or hints to the next movies that are coming out. And there's a fairly long one at the end of this movie, and it's okay. It's okay. They kind of basically show the Fantastic Four. I don't know. I was like, okay, yeah. I just felt kind of underwhelmed, and I was like, it's an okay movie. This isn't. I don't know. I don't know if I recommend this movie for people to go see in the theater or whatnot. On one hand, again, it's better than a plethora of movies that I've seen in more recent time. In a lot of ways, a lot better, more cohesive. But then ultimately, I was like, I just kind of forgot about it, and I'm not really thinking about it. It's been 20. Usually, when I do these shows, it's usually like a 24-hour period when I finally, because it takes me a little longer to kind of process my thoughts around things. So I usually give it 24 hours, and I woke up with the feeling of like I not really remembering anything, not really thinking about anything, and definitely not a desire to like, want to go see it again. It was just, because in your gut, when you've seen a film, or or you've listened to a certain album, you're just you kind of are excited by it. You're thinking about it the next day, or you can't wait to listen to it or see it again, and you're just kind of fired up by something. And this is just like, meh. It's yeah. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what the hell that's all about. But anyway, peace. Have a good day.